I'm Don. Today we're going to paint with the Frontier Wargaming wet palette. We are painting a Mammoth Factory miniature model. These were sent to me like a while back, and we're painting the first model from Mammoth Factory. We are doing just basic miniature painting, just base colors and then inks, and we're using again the Frontier Wargaming wet palette. Hi, I'm Don. Welcome to my studio. Oh, by the way, I'm enjoying my Paint Case version 2.0 by Frontier Wargaming a ton because it organizes my paints and it's so much fun to paint miniatures. This channel is supported by all these awesome brands. I made the mistake of using the wet palette in this video. I did not wet the sponge or the foam enough, and I just placed the paper on top of the foam, which is not, again, it's not wet enough. However, after using this wet palette a couple of times off camera, I kinda noticed that the foam is easier to wet or soak with water after some use. Using warm water or hot water is very helpful when you're trying to wet the foam. So since I made the boo-boo of not wetting the foam enough, the paper here in this video was kinda wrinkled until the end. But again, after some use of this wet palette, if you wet the foam enough or well enough, the paper will lay really flat on top of the foam and you'll have a really nice painting session. The key to using a wet palette is to never wet the paper, the top of the paper. You just keep it dry or moist since it will absorb a bit of the water from the foam, but never wet it with water. So again, you should put warm water on the foam so that it will become more absorbent and you will have a better painting session. But you'll see in the video here that I wasn't able to wet the foam enough. But again, I did manage to finish this miniature. In terms of the wet palette paper from Frontier Wargaming, it is better than ordinary parchment paper because it doesn't have that wax coating on top, which you have to heat up with warm water. This one, you just place it on top of the foam and it's good to go. The paper is also better than those Chinese brands wet palette paper, which has too much wax on them, thus they're not really absorbent enough. This one will keep the moisture of the paint on top of the paper and thus you have a long painting session. In terms of comparing the wet palette paper with the Redgrass palette paper, it is comparable with the disposable Redgrass paper, which is the non-reusable paper. Although this is a bit thinner, thus a bit more absorbent. But of course, the reusable wet palette paper are very economical and I highly recommend those. But this one, they're really good in terms of using them as a wet palette. However, these papers are disposable. Also, after painting this model, I kept the paints on top of the paper for I think a week. And then I closed the lid, which has a rubber, white rubber around the lid of the wet palette, and place it inside my Paint Case 2.0. So after around 4 or even 5 days inside my paint case, when I took out the wet palette, the paints inside the wet palette are still reusable. However, during my painting session, I needed different colors, so I simply replaced the wet palette paper. So the wet palette paper of this Frontier Wargaming wet palette is really good. As long as you soak the foam really well and make sure to use warm water, especially if you're soaking it with water for the first time. Other than the nice seal around the cover of the wet palette, which will keep your paints fresh for a very long time, The main strength of this Frontier Wargaming wet palette is also its weakness. The size of this wet palette is both its weakness and its strength. The small, very portable size of this Frontier Wargaming wet palette is kinda a weakness for me because I'm used to like mixing a lot of paints in a large wet palette. However, if you're not a messy paint mixer like me, the size of the wet palette is just enough. As I've said, the size of this wet palette is also its strength because it fits the paint case perfectly. So do I recommend the Frontier Wargaming wet palette? Of course I do, because I'm sponsored. Kidding aside, it works way better than those Chinese cheapo like wet palette cases and paper, and it's very portable. I highly recommend it, especially if you buy the paint case, and it goes really well with the paint case 2.0. Now we do some ink washes. You all know, especially if you're a long-time subscriber, that I love my inks over washes. Inks are more saturated than washes. They never cloud or fog up the details of your minis because they remain transparent no matter what. If you are using inks as washes, just add a bit of water so that you reduce the harshness or the saturation of the inks. Of course, washes will work, ordinary washes will work, but inks kind of give a more, gives more contrast to your miniature, but be careful not to overdo this as the miniature becomes darker really fast. If you're not confident with the effect of the ink on your miniature, or you find it too harsh, you may simply thin it more with water, maybe around 2 parts water to 3 parts water and 1 part ink, and do a lazy wash, and you'll see you'll get more subtle effect but very prominent effect at the same time. I applied around 3 passes of inks on this miniature, making sure that each pass, or making sure that I let dry in between passes. So I simply use a hair dryer to hair dry the inks and then apply a second and third pass. If you are painting an army though, I highly recommend that you just thin the inks with 1 part water and 1 part ink, or even 1 part water and 2 parts ink. You'll create faster contrast when you're army painting if you don't thin the inks too much. If you're a Citadel painter though, it's kinda comparable to contrast paints, albeit the inks are more transparent. Since we're comparing inks with contrast paints, I don't know of course, but I feel contrast paints are it feels like a mixture of paint and inks at the same time. So great stuff, contrast paints are great stuff, but I can't use it on camera. If you're interested on how to paint with inks, I have a ton of videos because you could simply use inks as your base colors, especially over zenithal priming. You could use unthinned inks with the airbrush. You could use it as sort of like a contrast paint over zenithal priming. Anyways, I'll put the links below the description of this video. Inks are also great for glazing colors, and you could mix them with mediums and such and use them as glaze paints. I also have a playlist on how to glaze miniatures. I'll also put that below the description of this video. So after applying around 3 layers or 3 passes of sepia ink and black-green ink and flesh wash ink, I then let the inks dry and we'll do some more highlights to finish off this Mammoth Factory miniature. I'll be painting more complex Mammoth Factory models soon. We're just finishing the studio renovations, and then we'll be painting a ton more this coming month. Now we apply more highlights. Basically, you could use the colors that you use as your base colors and just add a bit of ivory or deck tan to them so that you have highlight or pre-highlight colors. Ivory is a very yellowish, very warm highlight color, and if you add it to your base colors, it'll give you like a warmer, more saturated pre-highlight colors than just mixing with plain white. Sunny skin tone mixed with your base colors will produce a warmer like pre-highlight color in it, and it's like, I won't say it's better than mixing with ivory, but you're going to produce a warmer pre-highlight color. You could also use deck tan or like white gray, which will produce cooler highlight or pre-highlight colors. But we're going for warm tones here because we're painting wood. Now you see in the video, it's just a matter of like building up the highlights. You start with pre-highlight colors, or you could actually start with your base colors, paint those as pre-highlights first, because overall the miniature is darker because of the ink washes, and then you could use the base colors as pre-highlight colors and then mix those with ivory or sunny skin tone and create pre-highlight colors, and you build from there. If you're army painting, you basically just paint the base colors, do a bit of ink washes, and do initial highlights. But we're kind of going for a semi-golden lemon finish here, so we're painting more highlights. Like I always say, highlights in miniatures are the highlights in miniatures. You may choose to use our highlight sauce to prevent tip drying with your detail painting brush so that it's easier to do highlights. Our highlight sauce is basically watered down retarder medium, because retarder medium, Vallejo retarder medium, is very thick and creamy. So you just water it down around roughly 1 part retarder medium and 6 to 8 parts water. I highly recommend you try our highlight sauce. It's $100 at our website. Just kidding. Just get a retarder medium and water it down and use it to thin your paints when painting highlights. So that's about it. I'm pretty happy with the Frontier Wargaming wet palette, even though I wasn't able to soak the foam enough or well enough so that I'll have a better painting session. But again, you just use warm water, especially if you're soaking the foam for the first time. As I've said, the main strength of the wet palette from Frontier Wargaming is that it fits your paint case perfectly. But even if you don't have the paint case, it's really good. It's really great for quick painting sessions of really small projects. That's it, we're done with this really small Mammoth Factory model. I'll be painting more complex models really soon. I'm just finishing a handful of videos, painting videos for our main Vallejo channel, and also we're finishing up some studio renovations, but I'll be really active very soon. That's it, we're done. I hope you liked the video. Do like, comment, subscribe, and consider joining the channel so that you'll be part of our Discord community. Saludos!